I wonder if we reran the 20th century 1,000 times, if how many times the Soviet Union would collapse.
Yeah, I wonder about that too. And I also wonder about what would have happened if it didn't collapse and Gorbachev had found a different direction.
I mean, we see a very divisive time now in American history. The United States of America has very different cultures, very different beliefs, ideologies within those states. But that's kind of the strength of America. There's these little laboratories of ideas.
Until, though, that they don't keep together. I mean, I've had colleagues who have described what's happening in the US right now as a kind of soft secession with states, going off in their own direction
In
and the
what
center
in
not
which
holding.
states?
Well,
Well,
these kinds of conceptions that we have now of divisions between red and blue states
yeah.
because of the fracturing of our politics. And I'd always thought that wouldn't be possible in somewhere like the United States or, many other countries as well, because there wasn't that ethnic dimension. But in fact, many of the way that people talk about politics has given it that kind of appearance in many respects. Because look, I mean, we know from the Soviet Union and the Soviet period, and from where you're from, originally in Ukraine, that language is not the main signifier of identity, and that identity can take all kinds of other forms.
That's really interesting. I mean, but there has to be a deep grievance of some kind. If you took a poll in any of the states in the United States, I think a very small minority of people would want to actually secede, even in Texas, where I spend a lot of my time.
Yeah.
I think that there is a common kind of pride of nation. There's a lot of people complain about government and about how the country's going. The way people complain about the weather when it's raining, they say, "Oh, this stupid weather, it's raining again."
Yeah.
But really what they mean is we're in the smuck together. There's a together there that
I also feel that when I go around, because I mean, I've spent a lot of time since I wrote my book in last October, and this last year going around, I find the same feeling. But when I traveled around the Soviet Union back in the late 1980s, I didn't get any kind of sense that people wanted to see the end of the Soviet Union either. It was an elite project. There's a really good book called Collapse by Vladislav Zubok, who is a professor at London School of Economics at LSE. And Zubok is pretty much my age, and he's from the former Soviet Union. He's Russian, and I mean he describes it very quite aptly about how it was kind of the elites, that basically decided to pull the Soviet Union apart. And there is a risk of that, here as well, when you get partisan politics and people forgetting, that they're Americans and they are all in this together, like a lot of the population thing. But they think that their own, narrow partisan or ideological precepts, count for more. And in the Soviet case, of course, it was also a power play, in a way that actually can't quite play out in the United States, because it was the equivalent of governors in many respects who got together, three of them, in the case of the heads of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, who then, got rid of, basically the central figure of Mikhail Gorbachev. It would be a little difficult to do that. The dynamic is not the same, but it does worry me of having seen all of that close up in the late 1980s and the early 90s. I spent a lot of time in Russia, as well as in Ukraine and Caucasus, Central Asia, and other places after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But that you kind of see the same elite divisions here in the United States pulling in different directions and straining the overall body politic, and the way that national politics gets imposed on local politics in ways that it certainly wasn't when I first came to the US in 1989. I didn't, honestly, in 1989 when I first came here, I didn't know anybody's political affiliation. I mean, I rarely knew their religious affiliation. And obviously race was a major phenomenon here that was a shock to me when I first came. But many of the kind of the class, regional, geographic, kind of political dimensions that I've seen in other places, I didn't see them at play in the same way then as I do now.